Greetings, and welcome to Chaim's weekly podcast, recorded live in Richardson, Texas. We invite you now to join us for one of our synagogue's Shabbat messages.
When we returned to Texas, I was immediately greeted by all of your wonderful pollen. And so if I cough a few times, just think of it as welcoming me back home. We're pleased to be back here. I want to talk to you today about something that's been on my heart for a long time. As David has indicated, I travel in a lot of different circles. I really love being part of a Messianic Jewish congregation, part of the people of Israel. It's the center of our life. But there's a whole world out there that really has nothing to do with us. And I spent many years in academia, and I meet with professors and academics who are very, very intelligent people, very clever people. But yet, to speak of things of faith with these people is exceedingly difficult. I have a friend who's a professor of political philosophy, and we were talking about these issues, and he was saying that it seems that with all the tools that we have for apologetics and talking to people on the outside, that you almost need a graduate degree in philosophy and science to be able to speak to people effectively. And that struck me as odd because it shouldn't be that way. God did not call many people from these worlds. Most of us he called, he said, from, well, what shall we say? I live in the bluegrass of Kentucky, right up next to Appalachia, the poorest part of the world. Poorest part of this country, anyway. God has called a lot of us from those kinds of places. How can we speak into a world where we need these kind of tools to talk to people? When I was in high school, to give you a little bit of background on me, I was voted. Oh, I'm so proud of this. I was voted the most likely to end up in prison. I can promise you God has a sense of humor, because that's where I ended up. Not as an inmate, but I do also, I have a prison ministry. I go to, right now, there's a minimum security prison, and I meet with guys. I'm essentially the Jewish chaplain there, so I meet with Jewish inmates and Christian inmates, the occasional Muslim inmate, and others. And learning how to be able to communicate to these people. Some of them are really smart. I had one guy who actually got his law degree from Yale. Very appropriate place for a lawyer, I guess. I don't know. Hi, David. But attending the same study was a guy who had never graduated 6th grade. How do I communicate to these people about the hope that's within me? How do we really effectively speak with people? And so this got me to thinking, how do we communicate? What does God say about how we communicate to outsiders? Perhaps 30, 40 years ago, we lived maybe in a different era. I spent quite a bit of time in Zurich, Switzerland, about 3 years, doing a postdoc there. And Switzerland, of course, was the seat of the Protestant Reformation. A lot of very godly people there. There's a statue of John Calvin and Martin Luther and Heinrich Bullinger. And now I can't remember now. What's his name? The guy that was in Zurich. The guy that... Ulrich Zwingli. These four guys, okay, who were the founders of the Protestant Reformation. And it came from this area of the world, of Europe, of Switzerland. And so Switzerland is a very secular country now. People don't go to church. Actually, they do meet and they assemble together every week, but it's at the base of the ski slopes. Okay, it's a great place to ski and meet people, but they don't worship God anymore. But yet, there's a residual I guess, effect of the Reformation in the society. There's a sense of justice and these sorts of things. It's kind of a residue that's kind of hung on from the Reformation. I wonder if our world here in the United States has been the same way. 30 years ago, if you talk to someone, they would know something about the Bible. They maybe grew up in Sunday school, or they knew someone that did. They would be like a lot of American homes. They had a Bible on the shelf, and sometimes they blew the dust off of it and read it. But biblical concepts, biblical morality was a part of our conscience. And when people spoke of that, there was an agreement that these values, we share these values. Now, I may not like them, and I may want to go in another direction, but people recognized that they were deviating from what is really right in God's eyes and going their own way. Do you think that's the case today? It's not. In fact, just this morning I read a comic. I prepare for my sermons in strange ways. It was actually yesterday that I saw this, but it's a comic of two very well-known sports heroes today, and a media guy coming up to one of them, and the back of his shirt said Tebow. Anyone ever heard of Tim Tebow, right? And the caption above says, "I'm a Christian," and the media guy says, "Keep it to yourself." Then there's this other guy, some guy named Collins, and he comes out and he says, "I'm gay." "Buddy, you're a hero. Tell us more about it." This is the society that we live in. We no longer live in a society where there is a common idea of right and wrong. And so, how do we respond to that world? This is a very postmodern world, and the tools that have been developed for us, where we argue with people, and we say, well, you don't understand real right and wrong, but I do, just doesn't work anymore. I can't connect with people on the college campus, in the prison, in academia, the people on the street. I can't connect with them anymore when we talk about those kind of things, because there's no common center of right or wrong. We have to learn how to deal with that. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. How do we speak to outsiders about our faith? The questions people have really haven't changed over the years. They ask questions like, is the Bible trustworthy? Is it a bunch of fables? You say you believe in the Bible. What about evil and the goodness of God? What about justice and mercy? People ask these questions, and they struggle with this. And we can spend, well, you guys understand this saying, we can talk until the cows come home, right? And people are going to argue with us if we spend our time arguing. Why can't you admit there are lots of ways to heaven, and your faith is only one of many? What about your straight-laced morals? As long as we love each other, doesn't God approve of any kind of a relationship? I'll bet you guys have to deal with that on a regular basis. People think that what they're doing is a good thing. Have you ever tried to understand why that is? So I want to describe a little bit about this. People ask other questions like, it's not right to be intolerant of any lifestyle. The one thing that people know from the Bible is, you shall not judge, right? And they use that as a club. Don't judge me because your Jesus said that don't judge me. You can't do that. But they don't know anything else. I was listening to a radio program on NPR, National Palestinian Radio. Anyone ever listen to that? I shouldn't have said that, but it was a kind of a game show of kind of like, what do you know? It's, questions on things, and these very bright people who were very well educated were being asked these questions. And it was very funny because if it came to TV shows or, modern society, these sorts of things, these people knew a lot. But then there was a question about birds out of the Bible, okay? And the question was, so there's this dove that Noah let out from the ark. And when it came back, what did it have in its claws? Nobody had any idea. That's a part of our American heritage. You ever seen the American shield? There's on one claw, there's arrows, but what's in the other one? an olive branch. This is something that I would have thought everyone knows about. Educated people don't know anything about the Bible these days. We have to start there. We can't start with the idea or the assumption that they share any knowledge that we have or that they share any values that we have. So how do we speak to people? People simply don't respond well to facts or logic. There's a lot of pressure to be in the minute, to be very focused on myself. I'm the ultimate narcissist. I want to feel good all the time. If we argue with people, they just don't respond. We have to have a better way. And I think that the Bible teaches us another way. And this is kind of what I want to talk about. This is fun, trying to figure out how to go into this sequence. There's so much information here. God has given us another way to be able to speak to people that doesn't involve argumentation. There are two worlds that the Bible describes, okay? There is the kingdom of heaven. We've prayed for the people of Israel. We've prayed for the people of God and those of us who are a part of that in here. But do we recognize that there's another world out there? There's a world of sin and death. And that world has its own value system. There's a place where that knowledge comes from. And that's the kind of thing that I want to describe today. But to give you a sense of how we can do these things and speak of these things in a non-argumentative way, I kind of want to give a couple of stories here, of things that happened to me. I was asked not too long ago, about a year and a half ago, to, as a practicing scientist who's a believer, to come and talk to some college students who were biology and chemistry and physics majors. They were science majors. And they really wanted to hear from a practicing scientist about, science and the Bible. How can someone who's a science guy have faith? Because everyone knows that we came from nothing. Spontaneous generation is really how things happen. And there really is no God because we can't see him or anything like that. And so when I was asked to it, I thought, well, these guys want to talk about creation and evolution. What else do you talk about when you're talking about science and faith, right? So I met with these guys, and there were about 12 of these guys. Some of them had grown up in Christian homes. Some of them had not. They were clearly outside the faith. And a couple of these guys were actually very belligerent and hostile and ready to argue with me and show me how smart they were. And so I start questioning them a little bit, and I find out that these guys really knew nothing about what the Bible actually says about creation, about who God is, about who people is. They just knew nothing about these kind of things. So I decided, well, let's step back and let's, instead of arguing with them about the facts and the logic of creation versus evolution, let's start where people usually start. I said, how many of you guys have argued with people over whether God exists or not? They all raise their hand. Well, that's what we do, That's the big question of today. Does God even exist? How come we can't see him? So I asked them the question, what does the Bible say about being able to see God? The answer surprised me as well as these people. And this kind of led to this whole study. Does anyone know what the Bible says about the existence of God? Someone says, well, show me God and I might believe in him. Put this cage up here and put God in it, and if we can poke him, we'll believe in him. What does the Bible say about that? Does anyone know? Yeah. It says, if I show you him, I'll have to kill you. Okay? Essentially, that's what the Bible says. No man can see God and live. Right away, I realized that what God has done is he's taken away what I would consider to be a major strength. I can't show people God. And I'm a pretty smart guy. Okay? I can't demonstrate his existence. There's how many arguments for the existence of God? There's the ontological, the teleological, the philological. I just threw that word in for the fun of it. There are all these arguments for the existence of God, and they don't convince anyone, because for every argument for the existence, there is some logical argument against the existence of God. And so I pointed out to these guys that the Bible actually, instead of giving us a strength where we can point to something and say, see, God is here, he's actually taken that away and given us a weakness. He's given us what I call a strategic weakness. God has purposefully hid himself from the world, hidden himself from people. And we are not able to drum up evidences that point to him because they're simply not there. God says in a number of places that no man can see me and live. You remember Moses, the guy who knew God face to face? Moses had this problem. He said, show me your glory. This is in Exodus. This was, right after Israel has got into trouble, and they've perceived all these mighty miracles, and yet they turn away from the Most High, and they build their own image. And God's finally forgiven them, and Moses is now pleading with God, show me your glory. And what was God's response? No man can see me and live, not even with Moses. So the point is that God is hidden from us, and when we try to convince people that God exists, I think what we're doing is we're tilting at windmills. We're doing things that we're not able to do because God has not given us those things, and we need to learn to be comfortable with those. But God has given us two places, the Bible says, where God is seen. And one of those has been taken away from us in our postmodern scientific society. The two places are, number one, nature. The heavens declare the glory of God. Paul says that the invisible attributes of God have been clearly seen. Now that's an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. The invisible attributes of God are clearly seen. For people who deep in their heart they look and they recognize, oh yes, there's a designer. This is an incredible world, and there has to be someone who's involved with that. But it's not something that you can put your hand on because those attributes of God are not visible. They're invisible. But so that strength in our modern day has essentially been taken away because the reigning scientific paradigms tell us that we came from nothing. Or space aliens, I'm not sure. Actually, a major atheist, he proposes that we did come from space aliens. That's where life came from. Okay? But it's who wants to argue with Stephen Hawking? Who wants to argue with Richard Dawkins? These are very smart people, and they've worked very hard, as my friend on campus has said. These are professional God haters. And they spend their time coming up with arguments against God and the world. So even that strength has been taken away from us today. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with perhaps the very weakest thing that we could imagine for displaying God's presence to the nations. Does anyone know where that one place is? You're sitting in the middle of it. The community of God's people is the only place where the presence of God is displayed to the nations. And I don't think we understand both the incredible weakness of that and the incredible strength of that. When we love one another, we demonstrate God's presence to the outside world. Maybe in not logical academic ways, but it's very real. Let me give you a picture of how this works. When I was in graduate school in Oregon, we were part of a church, of a community there. This was way before I even knew there was a Messianic Jewish community, so we were kind of on our own in those things. But we were part of a believing community, and there was in this town, in this community, there was a woman who was a single mom. She had, I think, 3 kids. Was that right? Yeah. I can't count very well. 1, 2. I get confused after 2. We have somewhere between 2 and 8 kids at home, so. We have 5. Okay. And she was just chronically in poverty. She had inherited a house. She didn't have a job. She was trying to raise these kids, and her house was just falling apart. And so Jenny and I my wife and I kind of travel in these circles. We've always kind of had a heart for these people. So we were involved in their lives, and I was a poor graduate student living on $600 or $700 a month grand total. I didn't have any money to help. But I had friends who were like bankers and academics and upper middle class people that just were rolling in money from my perspective. And so we got together, an elder, several others, the pastor, and we got together at this really nice little upscale restaurant called Nearly Normal's Gonzo Cuisine. It was a hippie type place, very much, vegetarian, health food and heroin type of a place, okay? I'm not kidding. The guy ended up in prison for selling cocaine out of the kitchen, okay? It's a great place, really, really nice place to be, okay? Definitely part of the world of sin and death, okay? And we're sitting around this table having lunch, eating our bean sprouts and stuff, and talking about how we're going to help this lady. And we were plotting, we're going to raise some money, and we're going to build a fence, and we're going to put in a driveway to get rid of the mud holes so her kids can play. We're going to replace her roof and do some, repairs on her house to make it so it's a nice place to live. And we were plotting these for about an hour. And we had no idea that anyone was listening to us. And keep in mind, this was an academic community. So right next to us was this table where this woman and a couple of other people were listening in. And I knew this woman. She was a very prominent scientist at Oregon State University. And I could tell she was listening and overhearing what we were saying. And after we're finished, she gets up and comes over and she says, I couldn't help but overhear what you were talking about. And I'd like to know where you guys worship because it sounds like you've got some good things going on there. And these are people that I was sitting with who have PhDs, and they're really into being able to evangelize and talk to people about our faith. None of that fazed her. But she saw that we had love for one another. And that demonstrated the presence of God. I saw her show up the next week in our services, and she was there for at least 6 months. Then probably moved somewhere else. But do you see what I'm saying? We think we have to have all this logic and arguing and intelligent things to tell people. God says, I have other tools that demonstrate my presence, and people respond to that. Because then they become interested when they say, I see your presence here. They become interested, and then we allow the Most High to begin His job, which is to draw people to Him and turn their hearts to Him. Our job is not to do that. I think we get it mistaken. We think our job is to convince people, and then they come in and God starts working on them. But rather, we demonstrate His presence, and then God draws them. So I want to talk about that approach. How do we do that? How do we build community? How do we demonstrate God's presence in people's lives? Most importantly, when we have interactions with people, when we develop relationships with people, how do we explain to them what we believe, why we believe it, without falling into what I call tar pits, okay, of arguing. When you start arguing about whether God exists or not, you always fall into a tar pit that you can't get out of. I have very smart friends who say, I've got this guy on campus who has this faculty group of believers, and of course it attracts all the God haters, and so they end up arguing, okay, amongst the faculty, and so you have these people who spend all their time opposing the whole idea of God, and they come in and they argue. And Steve told me, he said, I never know how to get out of those tar pits and talk about what's really important, the good news. How do we do that? Is there a natural way? I don't think there is when we start arguing these things. So I thought, well, let's step back and let's look at the story of the Bible itself. Can I explain to people what I believe, why I believe it, instead of trying to convince them to believe it? I actually had a word from the Lord on this. It came from the greatest place in the world. It came from prison. was having this study with these inmates, and we were talking about these. I was asking them to help me. I said, you guys are here. You're trying to develop a community of light in a real dark place. These are inmates who have become believers, okay? And so we're encouraging one another. We're studying together. And they're having difficulty. How do I talk to people about my faith? They just make fun of me. And when we argue with them, I always lose. They beat me up. And I mean literally. I mean, prison's a place of very extreme emotions, okay? Even in the believing community, you have gangster activity. You have the Calvinists and the Arminians, and they fight each other and have territories, okay? How do we get away from this, okay? How do we teach people to have each other's backs, not stabbing each other in the back, so that they can demonstrate the love of God to outsiders? So we were talking about this, and how do we avoid arguments? And one of the inmates looked at me and he said, you know what I need to know? He said, I need to be able to convince people that I really believe this, not convince them that they need to believe this. A light went off in my head. I realized this is a word from the Lord. We don't tell people, we don't convince people to believe in God. We convince people that we believe in God. And we do this by having and growing in understanding of who He is and why there's only one way to Him, why we have to depend on Yeshua for our salvation, why this concept of morality is the only way for us. We don't convince outsiders because they're not going to be on board. So why waste your time? And so it was really neat because I'm obtuse. I don't listen very often, but this was a very clear word from the Lord. We need to learn to convince people that I really believe this. It's a very different thing than arguing with people about what they should or shouldn't believe, because they're not going to accept that. And so, with that, I want to begin to tell the story. I want to put that story in such a way that we can respond to people when they have important questions. I have a friend who is, well, he doesn't know what he is. Okay? Am I a guy? Am I a girl? Okay? He's confused about his identity. Okay? We developed a relationship. He thinks he's a believer. There are times when he thinks this, but he also thinks that we should be entirely accepting of the gay community because this is the way the world is, and he can't understand why we have to draw those lines. And in our discussions, I found that when I began arguing with him about what's really right and what's really wrong, never went anywhere. When I stepped back and I said, look, I said, we're of the kingdom of heaven. There's a world of sin and death, and this is normal for out there. And he's very conflicted about this, but he looked at me one day and he said, you know, maybe my difficulty is that I'm struggling with the fact that this is the result of the curse of Adam and Eve. All of a sudden, we had something to talk about. I didn't have to argue. He began to realize that, the Bible talks about sin and a curse and people not understanding right from wrong. And I'm experiencing the difficulties of that. And so this is a struggle for me. Do you see the picture here? When you stop arguing about what's really right and what's wrong and say, okay, yeah, there are more than one source of right and wrong. Well, now we have something to talk about. So, what does the Bible say about knowing right from wrong? I mean, it's clear as day, isn't it? I mean, don't steal, don't cheat, be faithful. Everybody should understand that. Remember what I said about a postmodern society that just doesn't accept that? My right is my right, and your right is your right, and of course, there's a problem when you have a 52-inch screen TV and I don't because I want it. But if I get it, well, then it's okay, right? Like I go steal it from you. It's okay because you can't judge and my right and your right. There's no way to really talk about these things. So what I want to do is look a little bit about what does the Bible actually say about right and wrong. Is it really easy to tell the difference or is it difficult? Let me get to my notes here. way, way back in the Dark Ages, before there was sin on the earth, Adam and Eve, according to the biblical story, this is a very important distinction here. I know this is true. I know this is real. People I talk to, they don't know. One friend of mine who teaches Bible as literature, he has a Catholic heritage, but he says, I'm going through my atheistic phase right now. And he doesn't believe these things. And I'm not going to convince him. He's probably smarter than I am, even though he has an English degree. That was a joke. He's a real smart guy, but he's going through an atheistic phase and saying, these are just a bunch of old stories and fables. Well, I can argue with him, fall into a tar pit, and we end up arguing about what's real and what's not real. Or I can say, what do you know about the story? What are the consequences of this story? So we step back, and I said, okay, so you think it's all fantasy and just fables, but that's okay. I'll let you believe that. But what does it say? Does this make sense to you? That's the question that I like to ask of people. We have beliefs that you don't accept, but can I explain them in a way that actually makes sense to you, even if you're not going to accept them? Once we start there, that works well. So way, way back, galaxy long ago and far, far away, there were these two people, and they were in a garden, the Garden of Eden. This is the creation story. This is where everything began. And they were in the presence of the Most High, right? And they didn't have any clothes on, and they were not ashamed. That actually becomes a very important picture that we'll talk about this afternoon, but we'll never get to the afternoon if I don't move on from there. So I want to talk about clothing because it's a very, very important concept to explain why sacrifice is important. So it's a wonderful picture, and people understand it today because you guys have all these really fancy schmancy malls. People spend lots of money on clothing. They understand these things. This is language that people can appeal to, okay? So Adam and Eve were walking with God, and they knew him face to face. And we know the story. Something happened. They went through, what shall we say, an evolutionary phase. And they gained some really neat things when they ate from the tree of, what was that tree of? The knowledge of good and evil. It's interesting that they actually gained something when they ate from that tree. What did they gain? Yeah, they gained Jiminy Cricket. Everyone knows who Jiminy Cricket is. Pinocchio's buddy that sits on his shoulders. Always let your conscience be your guide. They gained a conscience. They gained an independent idea of right and wrong from God. They were now autonomous from the Most High. I don't need God to tell me right from wrong. I got my own concept of right and wrong. This is what Adam and Eve gained. And they bequeathed that to all of their descendants. Everybody has an innate sense of right and wrong. You ever thought about that? That's why we argue about what's right and what's wrong. I know what's right, and it's not the same as yours. This college class that I taught, when I explained it to these guys, it's like they realized, I didn't know that the Bible taught that. Everybody has their own concept of right and wrong. Well, that's what I experience every day. Everybody is confused about right and wrong. They all have their own ideas. Are you telling me the Bible actually describes reality? But these are just a bunch of fables. You see the picture. We're starting to weave a thread to say that you don't accept it. You think this is old and outdated. But the Bible actually is a pretty accurate description of what our world is like, what we experience every day. And then what happened? Adam and Eve learned two things, okay? They learned that they hadn't gone to Saks Fifth Avenue at the right time. They missed the sale. They didn't have any clothes. And what did they do? What was their response? They hid themselves, right? All of a sudden, they were hidden from the Most High, and they could never come back into His presence again unclothed. Do you realize there's a huge change that happened? The Bible begins with clothing, and the Bible ends with a description of clothing. You anyone ever seen that? In the New Jerusalem, the holy city, where the tree of life is back, and the river of water of life is there, and the presence of the Most High is there. What are the rules for entering into the holy city? You got to have clothes. You got to have robes of righteousness. You have to have the right kind of clothes to come back into the presence of the Most High. And if you want to stay on the outside, that's where naked people are. Just like Adam and Eve were hidden from the Most High. They didn't have access to the presence of God. All of a sudden, we have time now and a reason to talk about sacrifice. Because sacrifice, according to the Bible, uses that kind of terminology of clothing. What does kippur mean? Yeah, my head's covered, right? Properly? It means covering. God provides a covering for us so that we can come back into His presence, just like what happened with Adam and Eve at the beginning. But it had to be the right kind of clothing. Not their choice, but God's choice. Okay, so let's get back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right and wrong. How do people know right from wrong? Again, we think that this is a strength. Morals, right and wrong, is so clear. But it's not. And the Bible actually tells us this. This is, again, what we think of as a strength that God has actually taken away from us, and He's given us really a weakness. So I want to do just a little bit of Bible study here. Genesis 3:22 says this. Adonai Elohim said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." They now suddenly had their own knowledge of good and evil that was independent of the Most High. They didn't have to depend on God for good and evil. So we have right now two sources of knowledge in the world. We have the Most High, who we can't talk to, we can't perceive, He's hidden from us. We have Jiminy Cricket, a conscience. Is there a third source of knowledge? Exactly. Revelation 12:9. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. When we think we know right from wrong, we not only have little Jiminy Cricket here, but we have a deceiver who twists that conscience and tells us this is what's right and this is the way we should do things. And so to be a believer in God is something you got to keep private, but to celebrate the gay lifestyle, that's now all of a sudden right and good. And if you guys haven't been reading the news, you're really not up with things. That's the new wave, and it's going to be forced on our society whether we like it or not. The gay lifestyle is all of a sudden right and normal, and if we don't get with it, well, we don't know right from wrong. You see the picture here. You have a conscience, and then we have a deceiver who speaks to us. But does the Bible tell us anything about this? Yes, it does. Wisdom and foolishness often look alike. This was a light for these guys when they realized that it may not be so easy to tell right from wrong. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Does not wisdom call, and understanding lift up her voice? Wisdom is personified in the Bible as a beautiful woman. She's a woman, and she sits and she lifts up her voice with wisdom and understanding. On the top of the heights, beside the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gates at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out, "To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the children of men. O naive ones, understand prudence. O fools, understand wisdom." It's pretty clear. There's a woman who is wisdom incarnate. And she calls out to us and says, make your path straight, learn and understand wisdom. But what about the other side of the coin? What about the foolish woman? What about the woman who speaks from darkness? Proverbs 9, 14 through 16. This is a very fascinating picture. The woman of folly is boisterous. She is naive and knows nothing. She sits at the doorway of her house on a seat by the high places of the city. Now, do you see a similarity? She's in the same place as the woman of wisdom, true godly wisdom, in the same place, using the exact same words. She looks the same. Calling to those who pass by, who are making their way straight, whoever is naive, turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. The naive one who is listening, he says, he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. The point is that these two women look the same. If you compare them, they look the same. They say the same words. They're in the same place. They talk to the same people. And they look the same. It seems to be so similar. What's right over here seems to be what's right over here. It seems to be so similar. So I'm married. I've been married for 5 years? No. Over 30 years, a long time, okay? And we're very, very traditional in that. We never let our kids date until they become adults. We're very into traditional marriage, okay? This is what is right, of course, okay? So I have people come to me all the time, young people, they come and say, so what's the deal about marriage? It's just a stupid piece of paper. How do you respond to that? You say, aren't you naive? Don't you understand? This is what's right and what you're doing is wrong. And they look and they say, oh, no. It's exactly the same. Look, we live together. We might even be committed to one another. We have babies together. And we just don't have the piece of paper. We don't need a commitment. What's the difference? Or two guys or two girls, they come together. And by the way, those are, oh, thank you. It's the pollen. Would you like some pollen? It doesn't come out like that. I'm sorry. Good and evil very often look and sound exactly the same. They both sit at the high places. They both cry out to those passing by. They both speak to the naive. But one ultimately lacks understanding. They say that these things on the surface, they look the same. We're committed to one another. In the prison and on campus and other places, homosexual relationships, they're the big new thing. And I have to deal with this almost on a daily basis, especially in a prison where you have 600 guys and no women. Okay? And they want answers. Why is this wrong? The problem is I can't give them a really good answer for that because on the surface, they look the same. Do you get my point here? Good and evil are very similar, and if we think we can tell the difference, we've had lots of training, we're in the presence of the Most High, our eyes have been opened, but those in the world of sin and death, they're not there. They don't see that. All they see is what's on the surface. And they don't know that death is what awaits them if they follow this path. No wonder 2 Corinthians 11, verses 14 and 15. Even the Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it's not surprising if his servants, who disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, also, whose end will be according to their deeds. Hear what I'm saying? Evil looks like what is good. We need to learn to accept that and recognize that I can't easily tell people right from wrong. They're not going to understand that. It's, instead of a strength, talking about right and wrong is actually a weakness. It's a strategic weakness that God has given us. We tell a story. We say, I'm in this kingdom. And it's a package deal. And these are the values, these are the morals that our God has told us we have to live by, and I'm demonstrating them in my life. Okay? People come to me and they say, it's so cool to just live together and all of that, but you guys have something in your life that I'd really like to have. You have a stability. You have an ability to speak to your children about things that I can't. I can't tell you how many people I know whose kids are in trouble because they don't understand the difference between these things. It looks good to me, And so it must be good. Our concept of right and wrong today is, does anyone remember Duke Ellington? Ever heard of him? The jazz guy, the jazz great, okay? But he said something. He said, if it sounds good, it must be good. We kind of take that approach in our society today about morality. If it feels good, it must be right. And you simply can't argue with that. So what we do is we tell people there are two worlds and there are two sources of knowledge. If you have died with Messiah to the elementary principles of the world, wise, if you're living in the world, do you submit yourself to these decrees that are all refer to things destined to perish with the use. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion, self-abasement, severe treatment of the body, but they're no value against philosophy and indulgence. Even in religious things look right, but they go in the wrong direction. There is a way that seems right to a man. What's the proverb? What's the ending of it? But its end is death. We don't understand that. I really don't think we understand the implications of this. There's a way that seems right to people. It seems wonderful. This is so good. But the end is death. We're really good at telling people about the consequences of this. We're not very good at telling them that there is another source of knowledge. And Adam and Eve needed to learn, just like we need to learn, to not listen to Jiminy Cricket. We don't listen to our conscience. Now, hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that conscience is an evil thing. But as believers, we need to learn to put that aside. Because when we come into the kingdom of heaven, somebody else calls the shots, not me. I have to put aside my concept of right and wrong and pick up God's sense of right and wrong. I have to learn to trust in that. There's an obscure verse in the Bible. It goes something like this. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not. Everybody knows this. Cool. Lean not to your own understanding. Then in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. You see the picture? If we lean on our own understanding, this is my sense, this has got to be right. We're going to be led down the primrose path that leads to the fires. Because it seems right, but it goes to death. We have to be active in putting off our own understanding and learning to lean on God's understanding. My master is old, but he's not old-fashioned. He knows what's good for us. I'm just not very good at learning to trust him. And when I taught these guys this, I said, this is what the Bible says about right and wrong. You go argue with people all the time about what's right and wrong. Those who are believers do this. Those who are on the outside, they also argue about what's right and wrong just from the other side. Okay? And it's like they said, wow, are you telling me that this is what the Bible describes? Because this is what I experience every day. We were no longer arguing about what's really right and wrong. We now had a reason to go to the Bible and say, well, what does this God say about what's right and wrong? Because it seems right to me, but I can tell you, most of these guys they pay the consequences of these foolish decisions that they make that seem so right at the time. Some of them have consequences that last the rest of their life. And that's why I go to prison, because these guys have made choices that every one of these guys, it seemed good at the time. I know I did wrong, it was illegal, but I was justified. It was right at the time. And they struggle with this because everybody does what's right in his own eyes. And rather than arguing with them, just say, yep, it's exactly what my God tells me the world looks like. And all of a sudden now you have some interest. Well, what else does he say? What else does he say about what's right and what's wrong? What else does he say about right living and living that actually leads to life instead of what I'm experiencing? There is a kind who is pure in his own eyes, yet he's not washed from his filthiness. My son, Do not forget my teaching. I want you guys to hear this so you can begin to understand that there are two paths. And we can follow our own path, and it seems so right, but it leads to death. Or we can follow God's path. And sometimes it doesn't seem right because it's counterintuitive. It goes against my conscience. But the end is life. My son, do not forget my teaching. Proverbs 3. But let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Don't let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Our concept of right and wrong is bound up in the very words of the Most High. Even if the whole world says they're crazy and they're silly. Because this is the path that leads to righteousness. Enter through the narrow gate, Matthew chapter 7. For the gate is wide and the way is broad. Everyone knows this picture that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter into it. But the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are a few who find it. When we speak about these things to people, they won't agree with it. I can promise you. People won't agree with this. They'll say, no. I have my own idea of right and wrong, and you just can't tell me that it's wrong. They're not going to agree with it. So, agree with them. Yeah, you're not going to agree with this. But this is a neat story. Does it correspond to your reality? And when they realize that it does, then something begins to happen. Now, I'm a little strange in my theology. I think that God has given his people an incredible responsibility. Adam and Eve were given 3 commandments. Does anyone know what they are? Initially, they were to fill the earth, they were to subdue the earth, and they were to guard the creation. Those 3 things. They were given an incredible responsibility. I'm not the one God says is going to fill the earth. You are. I'm not the one that's going to subdue it. You are. I'm not the one that's going to be the guardians of the creation. You are. He's given us an incredible responsibility. But he also intended for us to have the tools to do that. He intended for us to not know anything about this, but have to come to him for instructions. And instead, we chose our own path. And because of that, everything is broken. In fact, the whole of creation lies under a curse, and it's groaning to be redeemed because we screwed up in our task. He's given us, the people of God, a similar task. He's given us the responsibility to shine a light in darkness so that they can perceive who God is. He's given us that responsibility, and I don't think that we take that very seriously. We think that God's going to change everyone's heart, and he's going to appear to them in visions and this sort of thing. We pray for that, but I don't think God works that way. His visions are us. We tell the story, we shine the light, and then we let God deal with the people who now perceive that, because that's his job. He says, you tell the story. How will they hear if someone doesn't go? And how are they going to know if we don't tell them? But then God says that, don't be fooled. No one's going to come to me unless I draw him. What we want to do is prepare the ground so that God can begin moving in people's hearts. I truly believe that God waits for us to prepare the ground and then he moves. He's in, how do I say it? He's in partnership with us. And he's given us the task of displaying his righteousness and his reality in a dark world. We can't point to God and show him to people, but we can point to our community and show God to people. That's what we need to be focusing on. Do we have community? Do we love one another enough so that people can actually see that? These are simple concepts. What did the Messiah say in the Sermon on the Mount? Let your light shine in such a way that people what? See your good works and thus they glorify God on the day of visitation. We think we have to argue people into the kingdom. God says we need to act as a people who displays the righteousness of God to the nations. Yes, these values are old-fashioned to the world. They don't make sense that we have fidelity and honesty and we keep our vows and we don't listen to our conscience, but we stubbornly hang on to these words and say this is where right and wrong really come from. But the benefits are incredible. Deuteronomy chapter 4 gives us a picture of that. Is it time? I forgot when I started. Okay. David warned me, he says, don't go over 8 hours because people will leave. Okay. I'm going to finish up with this. Deuteronomy chapter 4 gives us a good picture of the Great Commission. This is Deuteronomy 4, 8 through 10. Keep these commandments of mine that I have given you, for they are your life. They're your very life. And when you do these things, what's going to happen? The nations will look, when you as a community live my commandments, the people from the nations are going to look and they're going to say, wow, what sort of a nation is there that has a God that actually lives in their midst? And they're going to say, what great nation is there that has judgments and statutes that are so righteous as this great nation is and these commandments that I'm putting before you today? These are the tools that God has given us in order to show people that God exists. There are two worlds. There's a kingdom of heaven. There's a kingdom of sin and death. We're going to outline this afternoon, and we're going to talk about how you get from one world to another, because that's the focus of what we talk about. How do people go from the world of sin and death? Once they realize that this is where I want to be, how do they get over? Because there's not lots of ways to do it. There's only one way, and we need to remember that. So I'm going to give you some homework. One thing that we as a family have done throughout the years is we have interactions with lots of different people who are on the outside, who are not believers. We need a venue to be able to speak to them of these things. So what we have done is we've chosen an ancient Jewish tradition to do this. Anyone ever heard of Erev Shabbat? Friday night meal? Friday night meals are an awesome way to do outreach. It's in your home. It's a little sanctuary. Your family is there. And if you're ambitious, like some of my friends are, like David, your friends are often there. The Chateau de la Fontaine Bed and Breakfast is the most wonderful place to do a vacation in Texas. It's an awesome place. It's a place where God is present. And there's comfort there because this is our home. These are our traditions. We invite people over from all stripes of life to have dinner with us. I've had Hindus. I've had atheists. I've had the occasional Muslim family over. Lots and lots of people who are just normal people who don't know God. They come and they have dinner with us. And we do a little bit of liturgy. We pray. We, bless the wine and the bread and the kids and my wife. That's a very important thing, by the way, to do. And what happens is people look at this and they say, this is really odd. This is neat. I've never seen anything like this. And we always, I follow the rabbi's dictum where they say, when two or more sit at a table and they eat, if they exchange words of Torah, it's as if the Most High is sitting with them. But if they don't, they might as well be sitting with a table full of idol worship. So we exchange words of Torah. We discuss the Torah portion. And we have fun doing it. My kids are always involved. So we do things like when we're talking about the tabernacle and the Haftorah portion in Ezekiel, one thing I pointed out to them that what does this Haftorah portion have to do with monster truck rallies? And the kids scratch that. They love doing this. It's so much fun. But it turns out that Ezekiel, when he saw all those wheels up there, what he was really seeing was a monster truck rally. My kids get into this. They love it. And outsiders look at this and they said, I never knew this was in the Bible. And you have an opportunity to talk and tell the story. Use these traditions that we hold so dear as a way to do outreach. It's safe. People come to your home. They're not going to come to synagogue. They're not going to come to a church. They're not going to come to a Billy Graham crusade, but they're going to come to your home, and it's safe, and they don't feel pressured, and you can talk about these things. So I would encourage you to find ways to use the strengths that we have, the community, the love of God, the Word of God, as a way to do outreach so that we can present to people these things, knowing that they're going to reject it because we're told that people see the light. This is in John. And what do? They say, I prefer the darkness. But all of a sudden they know there's a distinction and there's a difference. And then we have a chance to share the good news of the Messiah. There is a way to come into this kingdom, but there's only one way, and it's through our Messiah. So I'll stop there. We'll pick this up after lunch. Have a good week. Shabbat Shalom.
For more information, visit us at www.etzheim.org. That's spelled EITZ-CHAIM.org. Or join us in Richardson, Texas for our weekly Shabbat services.